All right, do you want to get started?
Yeah, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for hosting us. We really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with everybody and talk a little bit today about how to apply for graduate school. So to introduce myself quickly first, my name is Matthew Gold. I'm Associate Director of Admissions here at Claremont Graduate University. Specifically, I work with our Drucker School of Management, and I oversee all of our management and finance programs like our MBA or MS in Finance. I'm also a graduate student myself. I'm currently pursuing my PhD here in education. So beyond my time on this side as a staff member in the admissions side, also have some perspective as someone that's gone through that as a student as well. So add that perspective as well. So I will go ahead and pass it off to my colleague, Suzanne, to go ahead and introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Suzanne Abelnasser. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions for the School of Community and Global Health. And just a little background on me, I'm an alum of the Drucker School of Management. So I did receive my MBA from CGU, and I'm currently pursuing a doctoral program at Loma Linda University. So I also have a little bit of perspective to share on how to apply to graduate school and how to succeed in the process. So thank you for having us here, and I think we're ready to start. So for today's workshop, we're going to give you some details on, the graduate school application, the things that you need to look forward to when you're applying to graduate school. We'll also talk a little bit about the types of personal statements that you need to be aware of when you're applying. Things to keep in mind before you're drafting your personal statement, and then we'll finish it off with some tips for drafting your personal statement, and then we'll leave the last bit for Q&A. So let's go ahead and get started. So for the graduate school application, there are a couple of things you want to keep in mind. So the typical application materials are an online application form. So some schools have, a centralized application form. Other schools, have their own application form. So make sure that you are applying to the right application form. There's also an application fee. A lot of times universities will have an application fee, but there are ways that you can waive it. So I would recommend, reaching out to admissions representatives and seeing if there's an ability to waive it. I know that here at CGU, if you attend an event, we oftentimes will give a free application fee waiver code. And then we also have our official transcripts. That's pretty standard for any application portal. The resume or CV. And then oftentimes, if you're an international student, you'll have to submit an English proficiency exam. Our recommendation is that you look at the university you're applying to and see what are their international applicant requirements, and see if you're qualified to waive out of that or if you have to take it. In terms of program dependent items, depending on the program you apply to, they could ask for additional items. So when you're going through the application, you want to make sure that you're following all of the directions. You want to see if there's additional items that maybe this program is asking for that another program isn't, and you want to stay organized. So some programs might ask for GRE scores or other test scores. If you're applying to medical school, they'll ask for MCAT. If you're applying to law school, it'll be, the LSAT. So make sure you're paying attention to the program specific test scores. The other thing that a lot of programs will require are the letters of recommendation, and which is pretty standard. Usually it's anywhere between 2 to 3 letters of recommendation. So you want to be asking your admissions representatives, do I need to submit professional recommendations or academic? We'll go into depth about that later, but these are just some things to keep in mind. Some programs will also require a personal statement or a statement of intent. So make sure you're paying attention to the key differences between those. And then other programs will require a creative writing sample or an academic writing sample or even an interview component. So those are all things you should look into when you're applying to graduate school. Every school is going to be different. So don't assume just because one school is requiring a certain amount of materials that every program is going to do the same. So let's go ahead and talk about our GPA and test scores. So when you're going through the application process, oftentimes when you receive information from admissions representatives, one big question to ask is, how important are GPA and test scores? Some universities, like our university, we look at the admissions process holistically. So we're looking at everything from your letters of recommendation, your statement of purpose, to your resume or your CV to make a decision. So sometimes GPA and the GRE scores are not the most important things. So it's really important to ask admissions, are you looking at the application process holistically? So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of tests that you would take in graduate school, our number one tip is do not take these things lightly. Oftentimes, if there is a holistic admissions process, they're looking at so many different application materials in order to make that decision. And when faculty review committees are on the fence on an applicant, they will start looking deeper into test scores, into GPA requirements, and other application materials as well. Our number one tip is to consult your admissions representative to see how heavy these items weigh in the application process. But our best advice is always try your best, regardless of how heavily these test scores and GPA weighs. There is differences between different tests. So for example, there is the GRE versus the GMAT. You do want to ask if they require, one over the other, or if they'll take either or. So that's something to keep in mind. We mentioned the English proficiency exams. So one of the things that you have to do is, as an international applicant, you need to look at their international applicant page to see if that's a required exam. Sometimes in different programs, they also have field-specific exams. So I mentioned the LSAT, we mentioned the MCAT. So those are all things you want to keep in mind. And then lastly, you want to ask your admissions representative if the test scores are optional, because oftentimes these tests can be costly. They can take a lot of time for studying. It is a time commitment and a financial commitment. And oftentimes people have to take the exams more than once. So if you can waive out of that requirement, I would highly recommend looking into that, especially if your application is in solid standing. All right. And in terms of another application material that shouldn't be taken lightly is, you have to pay attention to your resume. So typically a resume can be anywhere between 1 to 2 pages, and it's really there to highlight who you are as a professional. So let's say you don't have a lot of professional experience. You want to highlight some of the educational experiences you've had or extracurricular activities. So these are things like, any internships that you may have done, any research projects you've been a part of. If you've published something, you want to include that into your resume. If you've won any type of academic or professional honors, you want that to be included there. If you have specialized skills or professional certificates, you want to make sure that those are highlighted in the resume, because like we mentioned, a lot of times schools are looking at the whole application, and sometimes when there's an area that you might not be strong in, you want to give yourself the opportunity to be able to be highlighted in different areas. So if you're an honor student or you have professional certifications or publications, those are all things that are going to make you look great as an applicant, and it's just going to make you more marketable for the program.
All right. So now looking at letters of recommendation, these can be really important. These can be really pivotal in your application. Getting strong recommendations can really make or break somebody's chances of getting in. And a weak recommendation can also kind of be like a death sentence in your application. So you really do want to put a lot of thought into this process, and specifically, first and foremost, in who you ask to be your recommender. So first and foremost, they should be either professional or academic references, so no personal references. So either somebody that you've worked for, or they were your supervisor. Typically, you want to choose somebody that's maybe a superior in that sense, that it's not necessarily going to be a colleague. If you decide to take a huge break from graduate school and you're 10, 15 years down the line, you try to decide to come back and you're the superior, you have you're the boss of your company or something like that, then you can choose colleagues. But typically you want to choose somebody that's maybe that you've worked under, or that you were kind of in like a reporting structure to, just because that will look better for when reviewers are looking at your application. For academic references, these should be faculty that you've worked pretty closely with, either taken a lot of classes with, built rapport with, or especially if you've had a chance, if you're looking at a research-based program, somebody that you've done research with, if you had the opportunity to do so. And with this too, I think something important or a tip that I always give with this too, is that don't look too much at title. Look at who knows you better. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but at the very bottom there, it says, what do they cover? So they talk about things like your work ethic, your collaboration, your ingenuity, all skills that are going to be really beneficial to succeed in a graduate program. And somebody that knows you a lot better is going to be able to speak to these areas more effectively and really write a better statement of purpose. So like a good example of this is, as you're thinking about who should write your recommendation, you think, well, okay, the chair of my department, I've met them a couple of times. It'd be really impressive if I got the chair of my department to write me a letter of recommendation. But again, maybe these meetings have been in passing. You maybe met them at like a mixer event at the beginning of the year. So they technically know who you are. They would recognize your face, but they haven't worked with you closely. You haven't taken any classes with them. They don't really know you. So their recommendation would be something like, so-and-so is a great student. I've met them a couple of times. I've heard great things about them. They're fantastic. That's not a great letter of recommendation. It sounds impressive because it's coming from the chair, but again, it's no personal details, versus if you've had a chance to work really closely with like a junior faculty member and you've worked on like a couple of research projects with them, taken 2 or 3 classes with them during your time, you really know them, you've really gotten to know them. That's a good recommendation, because they'll still, say the same things. They're great, they're fantastic, but I've had a chance to work with them in XYZ. They've done really good with blah, blah, blah. So they're going to write a lot more in-depth letter of recommendation. So really be mindful of who you're asking. Think of people that are really going to know you well, because they're going to write more effective statement or more effective letters for you. Regardless of how well you know them, it's still a good idea to maybe provide them with a draft of your statement and a draft of your resume, just so that they can get a little bit more details. I think it's also important too, as somebody writes their letter, to like make sure that what they have in mind for you is in line with what you're going to be presenting to the committee as well. They may have an idea of what your research interests are, but this helps solidify that, make sure that the information that they're giving to the review committee in your recommendation lines up with what you're saying in your statement and the information you're providing to them. Or it may be just a chance for them to jog their memory of like, oh yeah, I forgot that we worked on this project together, or something like that. And when to ask, keep in mind, the time of year that you're applying and that you're asking, especially if it's a faculty member. If you're asking at the beginning or the end of the semester, that's a really busy time for faculty members, because they're polishing up their syllabi or they're grading finals. You also keep in mind if there are any sort of like professional conferences happening around that time that they might be busy with as well. Or if you're going for a professional reference, think about what quarter it is and what time of the year it is. So you want to keep in mind of when they're busy, and you want to set a deadline earlier than the actual application deadline. There's a lot of times where recommenders, they're busy, they've got other things going on. This isn't necessarily priority number 1. So they forget to do it, or they're late on it. So you want to make sure that you give them more than enough time, and make them think that, if it's due on the 15th, tell them it's due on like the 10th or the 9th or something like that. So earlier, so if they forget, you can say, hey, actually it's due, I got a couple more days. Can you get in? It's like, oh, perfect. Let me get this together. I think also too, you want to give them enough time that they don't feel rushed, but also not too much time. So giving that deadline is important. I feel like the sweet spot's a month. You give your recommenders about a month to write your letter of recommendation. They're going to write you an effective letter and also not forget. They won't kind of just fall in the weeds with all of that. Anything to add, Suzanne?
I would just say that one really easy way to weed out, recommenders is asking them, are you comfortable writing a strong letter of recommendation? And then always give them an out and say, it's totally fine if you don't feel comfortable. I could ask someone else. Because oftentimes, we get applications that have very poor, or very generic letters of recommendation. And when, in the admissions process, if you're looking at the application holistically, sometimes when you're on the fence, you will look at those letters of recommendation. And we've, as admissions representatives, we've seen letters of rec that, the recommender wasn't even recommending the applicant. And so you really want to stay away from that. And the easiest way to do it is just to ask, be direct, and always, be low pressure. So give them an out if they don't feel comfortable.
That's great advice. And yeah, and I mean, I think the last thing that I'll also add to, when thinking about who to ask, think about to the program that you're applying for. If it's a more research-based program, academic recommendations are going to be much more important. If it's a more professional program like an MBA or something like that, professional are going to be more important. So you want to think about that too when prioritizing people, and never use a personal reference. I had a student when I was working with the psychology department a couple of years ago apply, and they got a recommendation from their pastor at their church. And straight up the faculty member emailed me back and said, this was a recommendation of death. Like, it talked nothing about, volunteerism or anything relevant. It was just, I know this person and they're great. So you don't want to do that. So make sure you avoid personal recommendations at all costs. Okay, so now let's talk about the interview component. So like Suzanne said, some programs are going to require an interview. Real quick, what do you do when a professor says, write the letter and I'll sign it? That's a good question. That's kind of a tricky situation to be in. I don't necessarily think it's a terrible idea, but I would say if somebody's going to come back and with that, you would probably want to find someone that's going to write a recommendation for you. Because either, if you write it for yourself, you're either not going to hype yourself up enough, or you're going to hype yourself up too much. And sometimes it can be a little obvious too to readers when they're looking at your recommendation of like, this is written the same tone. Is this just written by that person? So I would probably advise against it, would be my personal advice. Try to find somebody that can write it for you. Because again, they're going to write a better statement or a better letter of recommendation than you are. But okay, with the interview though, so interviews are definitely a really key component for it, for any program that's going to require it. A lot of times this is done with more professional programs, like our MBA here requires it. Some of our PhD programs require interviews as well, but really they're a chance to dig beyond your application and get to know you a little bit more. So it's to answer questions not found in your statement or your resume. So it's never to just say, hey, tell me about your resume again. It's always to dig a little bit deeper. It's a chance to demonstrate your fit for the program, how you're going to contribute in the classroom, showcase the research that you've done a little bit more, because a lot of times we'll talk about statements in a second, but they're pretty short, so you can't really talk about everything in there. It's also a chance to kind of interact with faculty and staff and alumni and see kind of how you interact in that environment and say, okay, this person is a good fit for our program. One thing to keep in mind with interviews though, because I know that they can be very nerve-wracking. They can be more nerve-wracking sometimes than speaking in front of a conference of 500 people in a room. Having especially the people that are going to be the kind of the fate, the deciders of your fate in front of you, can make them very nerve-wracking situations. But if you made it to an interview anywhere, this is true not just with graduate school, but also with like job interviews. If you've made it to the interview, you're qualified. So it's really just a chance to get to know you a little bit better. So don't worry about like, oh, I'm not ready for this or I'm not qualified for this. If you made it to an interview, you're qualified. So just be you, get a chance to really dig in a little bit deeper and show why you're going to be a good fit. And with these, you want to make sure that you're prompt, make sure that you're on time. If it's a Zoom interview, make sure that you're in there a couple minutes early at least. If it's in person, I would say like 5 to 10 minutes is probably a good time to be in the office before, because they always have a waiting area. I would say more than 10, like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that's probably too early. But 5-10 minutes, that's still your prompt, you're early. Be concise with your answers. It could be very common when you're nervous, at least for me, but I know with a lot of folks, to ramble on with an answer. So when they ask a question, take time, process it, think, and then answer, and be relaxed. Because like, again, I said, once you've made it to the interview component, you're qualified. So keep that in mind, be relaxed, be yourself, and you'll do great. Suzanne, anything to add about interviews?
Yeah, I would add one additional thing, which is, everything you touched on, Matt, was perfect. It was great. It's exactly what you should do in an interview. But you should also dress to impress. I'm not saying, put on your best suit, but, dress business casual. You want to make a great impression. Oftentimes in interviews, depending on the school that you're applying to, you might not need to prep that much, because some of those interview questions may be about your interest in the program and why you want to pursue that. And so that's going to be a question that you already know. But it's good to prepare a little bit, look at the alignment between you and that institution, because I guarantee there will be some questions that are regarding you as an applicant and how you're a good fit for that institution. So maybe organizing, a couple of notes before about things that you've accomplished, or your alignment with the institution, why you really want to be a part of it. Like, just little basic things like that can really help the interview component go extremely smooth.
Absolutely. Thanks, Suzanne.
All right. So for types of personal statements, there are a few things you should keep in mind. So every school has, different requirements for a personal statement. Some requirements will be a personal statement, and that is really focused on who you are as an individual. What are your values? What has your path been to up to this point, and why this particular program? And so the personal statement is really a story. I always tell people, write it as if it's a story. You want to address, what sparked your interest in this particular field, and what do you plan on doing in the long term, and then why this program. So show that program alignment. That is going to be the easiest way to write a personal statement. You just write those 3 questions down, you answer them, and then you kind of just find ways to transition from each area to the next. So before that, I would say, you have to identify what is the type of statement that they're asking for, because there is a statement of purpose or a statement of intent, and that's going to be more focused on why are you pursuing this degree and why is that important to you? What are the resources that this program offers that you plan to use to be successful? What faculty at the institution are you looking forward to studying with or doing research with? And then how do you plan on using this degree career-wise? So what do you plan on doing in the long term? Oftentimes, statements of purpose and statements of intent, they kind of blend in together. There's a lot of things that there's a lot of components that are maybe part of a statement of intent that could present themselves in a personal statement. So really talk to your admissions representative and see, is there key differences? Is there something specific they would like to see? Just go ahead and seek guidance, because that's going to be the easiest way that you can achieve a successful personal statement. There's other types of statements that you might have to submit. So for some programs, they might ask you to submit a research statement or an artist statement. So make sure that you are, communicating with the university, that you're paying attention to the application, to what the application is asking you, because the last thing you want is to put in all this work, put in all this money to submitting applications, and then find out that you haven't even answered the prompt that they're asking.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly to when a university does use personal statement or statement of purpose. They do it intentionally. Sometimes they can feel like they're interchangeable, but really they're looking at, like Suzanne said, they're looking at very different things. And some institutions actually ask for both for that reason. So be mindful of what the university is asking for and write accordingly.
Great.
So now going into the drafting process. So some things to keep in mind before you start drafting. So first and foremost, is there a prompt? Some institutions may just have a very generic thing, just tell us about, just write us a personal statement. Some may be a lot more specific about like questions that they want you to answer. So you want to look at the prompt, make sure that you understand that, and make sure you understand that for each individual program that you're applying to. Are they asking for both a statement of a personal statement, a statement of purpose? Like I said, sometimes they may ask for both. So look into that, make sure that you're providing the university with everything that they're asking for. Look if they require a word or page limit. It's really important to stay within those limits. I'll talk about that in a second. And then are you applying via a centralized application or unique to that program? So all of these so that you know where to turn that in. Because the last thing you want is to scramble last minute to figure out where to go or not be able to find it. So you want to make sure that you know where you're turning everything in and exactly what the institution is asking for. And so now you're going into the drafting process. So here's some tips for drafting. First and foremost is get creative with it. Creativity is really important. So you want to make sure that you want to make sure that you can stand out with this. A lot of times, the personal statement of purpose can be the most important thing in your application. When you're applying to programs, so from the academic side, a lot of people can have pretty much the same academic profile from your resume. A lot of people have the same professional or research profile. And from the statement or the letters of recommendation, they may all be relatively similar as well. So a statement of purpose is a chance to really stand out from other applicants and really make a case for yourself. And being creative is a great way to do that. I think first and foremost, expressing your passion is a great way to be creative. When you talk about something that you're passionate about, it really comes out in the paper and it really does create an effective statement. And consider too, when you're going through the editing process, to read it out loud, read the essay out loud. This gives you a chance to kind of hear what it actually sounds like versus reading it in your head. Because if you read it in your head, I think you have a tendency to correct things a little bit more. But reading it out loud, you're more likely to catch those errors. What I like to do too with my papers is Microsoft Word has an option where it will actually read it back to you like a robot voice, but it helps you catch a lot of those errors. Like when you use the wrong word that's like close or something like that, it'll help you find those errors pretty well. And then when you're drafting too, stick with your style. I think that's important. Don't try to change something. If you're pretty comfortable in your writing style, go with what makes sense. So when you're drafting, for some folks, it's easier to just write everything, just kind of word vomit onto a word processor and then go back and edit it from there. So if that's your style, go with that. For others, like for me, I like to do a bulleted outline and then build a paper off of that. So go with what makes sense for you. Go with what you're comfortable with. Don't try to change anything if you're comfortable in your writing process. Anything else here, Suzanne?
No, I think everything was covered.
Okay, and then some important do's and don'ts to keep in mind. So first and foremost, start early. Like I said, this may be one of the most important pieces of your application. So you want to make sure that you give this statement more than enough time. Give yourself more than enough time to write this statement so you're writing a really effective paper. You don't want to wait last minute because you're not going to write a good paper. Secondly, you want to revise. Make sure that you're editing this thing to be as perfect as it possibly can be. Make sure you catch every grammatical error, that your sentences make sense, that the the paper is as good as you could possibly get it. Not that these small errors can make or break an application, but if it's a difference between you and another applicant and then you had a grammatical error, it might be. So you just want to make sure that's not even a part of the conversation when it gets to the review committee. So revise as much as you possibly can, and have multiple people read it as well and offer their feedback and their edits. Like I said, when you read your own paper, you have a tendency to correct things in your head, even if you're doing the Microsoft thing and it's reading aloud to you. So you want to get other eyes on it to not just find those grammatical errors, but also offer their feedback, because you may have an idea of what makes sense in your paper and what makes sense when you're writing, but somebody else might be like, I have no idea what you're trying to say here. So you want to ask other people. And I think too, you want to ask others, but you also want to not ask too many people. There is such thing as too many opinions on your paper. I think the sweet spot's about three different people to read your paper. And what you also want to do is make sure those three people are coming from different parts of your life. So, ask a colleagues, like one of your friends or your roommate or something like that. So you get a perspective from there. Ask somebody from your writing center, because they'll give another perspective. Ask somebody from, ask a faculty member to look over it, maybe one of your recommenders. But people are going to come from it from different perspectives as well. Because if you ask all of your friends to read it, they're probably going to give similar feedback. Or if you ask a bunch of faculty members to read it, they're probably all going to give relatively similar feedback. So ask different people and try to ask not too many so that you're not overwhelmed with opinions and feedback. You want to make sure that you follow instructions. Everything is there for a reason. So you want to make sure that you're answering all of the questions. If there's a very specific prompt, you want to make sure you're staying in the word count, all of that. I think this is probably one of the biggest piece of advice, or one of the best piece of advice, I think, with this too, is show, don't tell. And what I mean by that is when you're writing your statement of purpose, details are really, really important. Those are usually the things that also make or break a statement of purpose. So you want to show what you've done rather than just tell. So like an example would be if you did a research project that relates back to the program that you're applying for. Don't just say, oh, I was a research assistant working on this project and it really helped prepare me for this program. That doesn't tell anything. It may be on your CV, it may have some details there, but you still want to expand on it a little bit more in your statement. So you want to say, I was able to work on this research project with Professor so-and-so, and I was in charge of X, Y, and Z, and we really explored, whatever. That adds those details. That shows the committee, like, this is the work that you've done. This is the type of experience that you have. And then they can draw the lines of like, oh, this really prepares the student for this program. And do tailor your essay to each institution and program. So don't template your essay. I think that is another big piece of advice. It can be really tempting to say, oh, I'm applying to 5 different schools. They all have the same prompt, or they all have a general prompt. So I'm just going to write a templated essay and just plug in the name of the university and move on. That's a big mistake, I think. First and foremost, that leaves you open to errors. I can't tell you how many students have done this and uploaded the wrong statement for the wrong institution. Like they're applying to us, but Pepperdine University is on there or something like that. And while again, that may not be a make or break, it doesn't look very good for you. It shows that you're not necessarily super committed to that institution. So you want to avoid that mistake by writing a specific essay to each institution. The other reason is that there's probably a reason for why you're applying to each individual school. It's different from the others. And if you're able to speak to that in your statement, you're going to write a much more effective statement and really something that sticks with faculty members as they read your statement. So some of it may be very similar. So like when you're talking about your experience or you're talking about your passion for the field, those might be very similar from statement to statement. But try to write down a specific one for each institution, because you're just going to write such a better essay in that respect. And don't, ever since I was little, avoid cliches as best you can. Can't tell you how many essays I've read in my time that start off ever since I was little. I've always wanted to be, X, Y, Z. That may be true, but I can already tell you now, if you start off with those type of cliches, faculty members, if they're the ones reading, are going to roll their eyes and just skim through it and move on. You want to be creative, but you also want to avoid those cliches. And again, try to make your paper unique and stand out. Don't go beyond the word or page limit. They're there for a reason. Lots of programs get, thousands of applications, and they only have so much time to review each individual application. So they have those word and page limits there so that, people aren't turning in 10-page essays and they don't have to read 10-page essays. If it's 500 words, stick to 500 words. If it's 3 pages, single space, stick to 3 pages, single spaced. If you happen to go over, so let's say it's a situation where it's, 3 pages, single space, and you do 3 1/4 page, and there's nothing that you feel you can cut out, touch base with the admissions representative to see what their opinion is. For some programs, they maybe that's fine. You're barely over the word limit. Don't worry about it. Some may say, no, you got to cut it back. You got to bring it back. So ask if it's over a page, and if it's over a half a page of the page limit, then you would for sure want to edit and bring it back. But if it's barely over, just touch base with somebody in the department. They'll give some good advice. Nobody in the department also is trying to set you up for failure. I guess that's the other thing too. Like Stan said, number one piece of advice, touch base with admissions representatives or people in the department, because we're all here to help. We all want to help you put your best foot forward so you have the best shot in the application process. So utilize us as resources, absolutely. Don't wait till the last minute. Again, this is extremely important. Don't use a template and don't rely on your grades to get you in. Like we've said, GPA, the academics can be impactful, but people are pretty self-selective when they apply to graduate school, so they probably are all relatively qualified, and everybody may have a very similar academic profile to you. So don't bank on that. Don't bank on a 4.0 GPA. Don't bank on your near perfect GRE scores. They may be great, and definitely don't hurt you, but you want to make this is a chance for you to really set yourself apart. So don't rely too heavily on that.
I actually have just 2 things that I want to emphasize, even though you already touched on them. The 2 things are start early. And I want to emphasize this because oftentimes, and this even happened in my experience writing my personal statement, oftentimes you write the statement, you write a draft, and it's just, you feel like something is missing and it's not, or you feel like it's not perfect yet. And sometimes you just need a little bit of time to give you perspective on like why you really want to do this. Like it's, so if you wait to the last minute, or if you don't start early, you're going to be rushing that creative process. You're not going to be able to properly put into words what you really want out of this program, what this really means to you. So, so start early, because again, those word limits, you're going to have to fit everything that you want to say in a 1 to 2 pages or 1 to 3 pages most of the time. So, so just wanted to emphasize that. And then the second thing I wanted to emphasize is follow the instructions, especially when you're applying to master's programs or doctoral programs. The faculty review committees or the admissions committees, they expect a lot. And if you don't follow the directions, they will toss your application out the window without even looking at the other application materials. There are institutions that are a little more flexible. Maybe you didn't follow the instructions, but they're still willing to consider you. But there are other institutions that will throw your application out. They won't even look at it because you didn't follow the directions. So can't emphasize that enough. Don't forget, that's really one of the most important things.
Yeah, and then even beyond just not getting admitted to the program, and this stuff can also affect your funding packages. It can affect that kind of stuff as well. So, following instructions could be the difference between you being a top ranked applicant or a normal applicant. So, or normal admit. So you want to make sure that, again, yeah, definitely great advice, Suzanne. And that actually brings us to our last portion, our Q&A. So thank you again so much for sticking with us. I'm also going to go to the next slide. So that here's our contact information. So if you don't have questions now, but you think of a question later, feel free to reach out to either of us or our general admissions office. We're definitely all more than happy to help out. like I said, we're here to set you up for success. So definitely utilize us as a resource, but please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or type it in the chat. Happy to answer those questions now.
Hey, this is Sarah. I'm just curious because, I work with grad schools and students applying to grad school too, in regards to the GRE and test materials. So I've seen a trend that less schools are using the GRE, and it is still being used by some. But just in general, just kind of curious about what that's like at your university and what you've been seeing. Is there a downward trend in requirements for testing, or are you seeing it mixed, or what are you seeing?
So it will depend on the program. There are programs that are still requiring it, especially if it's a heavy quant program. So for example, like our math program is going to require those types of tests. I'll tell you, in my department, I'm in the School of Public Health. For master students, we have left it as optional. And for PhD students, we have made it a requirement. But for DRPH students, which is our other doctoral degree, it's a professional degree. We have made it optional, but they have to submit an academic writing sample instead. So it is going to be very department specific, but I do think that we have been examining a lot of things around the GRE and equity and diversity, and just making it a more equitable admissions cycle. And so one of the talks that have been, I think there have been talks in every school about potentially waiving the GRE completely, but there are going to be programs that will require which will require it for one reason or another. I don't know if you want to add anything else there, Matt. But
yeah, no, I think you covered pretty much just about everything. Like the biggest thing that I've seen, at least on our campus, but also in a lot of programs, is, I mean, it's a different story between master's and PhD programs. A lot of faculty are still kind of reluctant to move away from testing requirements, especially for doctorate students, and especially in quantitative or research heavy programs. For like our MBA program, we still require the GRE or the GMAT, but we're a lot more lenient in our waiver process as well. So that's another trend as well, is that across our institution, but also across the country, maybe programs aren't necessarily going completely test optional just yet, but they may be a lot more lenient on the waivers. So like for the MBA, for instance, if you've done a lot of classes in statistics or business analytics, or you have a degree in a more technical degrees like in finance or something like that, then we'll waive it. Or if you're coming back to school after years of work experience, we might waive that as well. So definitely a little bit more lenient on waivers. I think industry-wide with graduate schools, we're moving in a direction to either be completely test optional one day, but I think we're still a few years off from that. But yeah, to Suzanne's point, it is a lot about equity. It's a lot about championing diversity in that sense, and being a little bit more accessible to students. So it's a mix. There's a big fight going between staff and faculty, and even amongst faculty, about what the right direction to go is. But it does seem that we're moving in a more test optional future. Any other questions, though?
Just a general question that I know a lot of students have for the recording. How many grad schools did you apply to?
Go ahead.
how many grads? Okay. Did we personally apply to?
Or how many programs would you recommend someone apply to when they're looking at applying to grad school?
Ooh.
I would
want to take this one.
Yeah,
okay.
I would say you definitely want to limit the number of graduate schools. And there's a couple of reasons. I mean, first and foremost is to save yourself time and money. Like we said at the beginning, there are application fees associated with pretty much every application. You may be able to waive some of those fees, but like even when using central application systems like SOFIS for public health, a university can't waive the application fee for you there. So you want to limit for that. And also too, you got to request official transcripts that cost money. So it saves you money if you apply to less schools. It also saves you time. Again, because like you said, you want to be able to write a statement of purpose for each individual school. So you want to give enough time and attention to each individual school. Your recommenders too, they may decide to write, a specific letter for each institution as well. So you want to be mindful of their time. Then they got to turn the thing in regardless. So you want to be mindful of that as well. So less schools is less margin of error for somebody to forget to send it to one school or another or whatever. But I think also too, it means that you've done your research on these different institutions as well. Every school, the higher up you go in terms of, your academic journey, so from bachelor's to master's to PhD, you get more and more specific about what you're going to be studying there. And each individual school, especially on the graduate level, has a very specific specialty. And you want to make sure that when you're finding your fit, finding that program, that these are schools that are going to focus on what you're interested in. You want to try to avoid places that are going to be, maybe they're in the periphery, they focus on this stuff. But you want to make sure that you're finding schools that really meet your fit and match match what you're interested in. So you want to do the research. I feel like the sweet spot, I would say probably not to go above like 5 or 6. If you go above 5 or 6, that's probably too many. Sweet spot is probably like 3 or 4, because then you still have options if you don't get into one school, and you have options to say like, okay, well, these are the schools that really make sense for me. Now it's from a financial side, make sure this makes sense, or from a location side that this makes sense, but no more than 5 or 6. Sweet spot's probably 3 to 4.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think it is going to be individual. It's going to be very specific depending on that student, right? So like as an applicant, you have to evaluate your own skills, your GPA, your GRE scores. There's so many different strategies to figuring out how many schools you should apply to. And like Matt said, it all is going to depend on research. I don't know, one strategy that I would deploy is like, look at what are your 3 top schools? Like you would be happy to get into any one of them. Are you qualified for that, to apply to those schools? Talk to those admissions representatives, find out how to present, the most perfect application. And then I would then, have the 3 top schools that I want to apply to, and maybe 2 or 3 backup schools. So schools that, that you're qualified for them. Maybe they're not as competitive as the top schools you picked. But they're schools that you would be happy to go to attend. So I would, there's so many different strategies. I would look at it like that. Obviously, like Matt said, you don't want to overwhelm yourself with applying to 10 schools. I think, 6 is like a max. But yeah, you really have to reflect and examine, what kind of applicant are you? Are you a competitive applicant to begin with? Because if you're not, you might want to apply to more schools. If you feel like, oh, I have, my GPA is not where it should be, or my test scores aren't where they should be. So maybe I do need to expand my, my application process a little bit. So yeah, it will be individual. And then there are people, like, I'll tell you from my own personal experience, I had my eye set out on a specific school and I only applied to that one school. And I just told myself, if I get in, then that's great. If I don't get in, then I'll have to figure out what I want to do next. But yeah, so it really just does depend. Any other questions? Those were great questions, by the way.
Yeah,
really.
Thank you. Well, I think that might be it. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. But thank you again for hosting us. We really appreciate you letting us come and speak to you. Hopefully you guys got a lot out of this. If you need anything, please, again, feel free to reach out to either of us. We're more than happy to help where we can.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. And everything was recorded, so we'll send the recording out to everyone who registered. Awesome. Thanks.
Awesome.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care.